Dear chess friends, I am absolutely thrilled to show you one of the finest attacking games from the Champions Chess Tour final, which is taking place this week in Canada, Toronto. It is a beautiful game between Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces against Alireza Firouzja with beautiful sacrifices, with some nice tactics, but also some very clear attacking plan. And I will try to explain you all the ins and outs of this beautiful attacking concept. Just let me remind you that you're just one click away from helping me a lot by becoming a subscriber to the Robert Riss Chess channel. And I appreciate all your support, so please help me. And then I promise to cover more exciting games from this tournament and also what's happening in the weeks after. Let's have a look. Fabi starts with the move 1e4, e5, and we get to see the Italian opening, which is one of the most popular openings at the highest level, at club level as well, of course. It's an easy opening to play. Both sides are just bringing their pieces out, playing for central control. This has all been seen thousands, millions of times, even at various levels. And we are not going to discuss all the ins and outs. I will bring you the position up till move 10. A lot of pawn play in the beginning. Kind of useful waiting moves trying to improve both sides their position. Bishop goes back to a7, rook to e1, black goes h6, knight bd2, black goes rook e8, and now white goes for the move b4. So white clearly reveals its plans already by advancing with the pawns on the queen side. Maybe at some point you can try to break there. But now, after black's next move, bishop e6, we have the first interaction between a white and a black bishop. White has to make a decision here. What is he going to do with that bishop? Bishops are going to be exchanged. And white decides to take here himself. And black recaptures with the rook. Very often you also see black taking back with the f-pawn in these structures, getting doubled pawns on the e-file. But then it's often better to have your rook on the half-open file. Now the rook is on e8. You do take back with the rook. Bishop goes to b2. And now interesting move, knight h5. So the knight is on its way to f4. It's a very typical idea in this opening. And it becomes a very important idea in this game as well. Just one thing I would like to point out to you. Once you put a knight on h5, it's unprotected and you have to be very careful because the queen is eyeing that knight. And tactics like knight takes e5, they can sometimes win material for white. However, not in this case. Black will recapture with a knight, and if white takes the pawn, the queen on h5, the knight, then the knight on e5 can just take on d3 materials even. But the main problem is that everything is hanging now, and white's position falls apart. So no time for this plan. White goes for the move knight f1. Black played here the move knight e7, so the other knight is coming over to the king side as well. Very typical plan. Question is, what should white do? White can consider advancing in the center. Move like d4 is possible, but Fabi goes for the move c4, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, but there's not much work to do here yet. Pawn on e5 is closing the diagonal for the bishop on b2. Black goes knight g6, and now both knights are about to come in to the f4 square. And that's a very important square for later. There are popping up some attacking possibilities against the white king. So therefore white thinks, okay, I should play here this move, g3. And it looks like a very efficient way of controlling this square and ensuring that both knights remain out of play. But not everybody thinks like Fabi, and not everybody thinks like Alireza Firouzja, because Fabi definitely didn't expect the move played by Alireza at this point. Knight gf4, guys. Welcome to this insane position. The knight just goes to a square which white considered to have covered with a pawn. And this is a very serious move. Can you keep that knight alive? Black is threatening to take the pawn on h3 with check. So taking the knight is, of course, one of the critical moves. Another option is to protect that pawn on h3 with your king. It might be a move Fabi had considered here, but leaving your pawn on f2 en prie, it's not an easy decision to make. And well, it's an interesting line. Maybe this was a better idea. I can show you one line. Bishop takes f2. You attack the rook. Pawn takes knight. Black captures the rook. And if you do take back with the queen, for instance, then knight takes f4. It's a position with white having a knight and a bishop against the rook and 2 pawns. Seems to be favoring black. But instead of taking back on e1, clever intermediate move would have been f5. With the idea that black cannot take that pawn on f4. Now the rook is under threat. If you move the rook, then you take the bishop. But probably the best here is to move the bishop, take the pawn, and after pawn takes rook, then you take back with the pawn with an unusual position of 3 pawns versus a knight, but white's king is still open, the queen, the rook, and the bishop. They are soon joining the attack against the white king again. So maybe white is better objectively, but things are far from clear. Anyway, you're more interested in what happened in the game. White captured the knight on f4. What's happening after this? Rook g6, check. King goes to h2, and now it's knight takes f4. That's a good move. Black has now 2 pawns for the piece and has a huge threat of coming in with the rook to g2 at the right moment. Of course, also the pawn on f2 is still hanging. So white's next move is obvious. Knight e3, preventing black from capturing the pawn, and the knight covers the g2 square. Well, this is a very interesting moment as you're here having a difficult moment as black what to play. In the game, the move queen d7 was played. It's a very interesting move as you're threatening to take on h3. That's one possibility. The other option is to take on e3. Now after taking back, you can enter with the rook on g2. The king has to go back, and now you can play the move queen d7 with the idea to take on h3. No time to take the knight because of queen takes h3, and it's going to be checkmate next. The only option here is to go back with a knight to g1 to protect the pawn on h3. But after rook takes g1, king takes g1, queen takes h3. Black is threatening checkmate. White can take that knight and black has only a perpetual. This is a correct way of playing. But definitely, once you have sacrificed the piece, you're not thinking at this point how to make a draw. You're playing for glory. You want to win this game. At least that's how Alireza plays this position. And instead, he goes for this move queen d7, threatening checkmate in 1. White needs to decide now how he's going to deal with this threat. But having kept this knight on the board, not trading it off with the bishop, there is this option to play knight f5, which was not played. I think bishop takes f2 is a move which Fabi didn't like. Black is having 2 pawns for the piece, and after moving the rook away, well, things are complicated. It's not obvious what's happening here, but you may give a check with the bishop on g3, and it's a very tricky position with an open king, especially with shorter time control. This is not much fun to play. If you do take the bishop, it's queen takes h3, and mate will follow. So you got to move the king, and then maybe black can even take on h3. It's a total mess. So instead, Fabi wanted to play it safe, and instead of blocking actively with a knight on f5, he played knight to g1. But look now, another sacrifice to eliminate a defender. Rook takes g1. That's the key move. You cannot take back with a rook because of queen takes h3, checkmate. Therefore, white got to take here with the king. Queen takes h3 is going to be played anyway. And now, white is a rook up. Okay, black has 2 pawns, but these pawns, they are not important. Well, mark my words, because maybe the pawns will become important at some point. What happens here is that black is about to take on e3 to eliminate that knight, which is covering the g2 square. If the queen can just give check on g2, it's just mate. So you got to do something about it. The most obvious move seems to be queen g4 to offer the exchange of queens. But black can play here bishop takes e3. That's why queen g4 was not played by Fabi. Now, you cannot take back on e3 because then black takes the queen on g4. So queen takes h3, knight takes h3 with check. And you have a problem here, because if the king goes to g2, now both the bishop and the knight are hanging, but with knight f4 check, you're securing your knight. White got to solve the check with its king, then the bishop can go anywhere, and black is better. With a knight and 2 pawns for the exchange, that's really, really good news. So that's not a possibility. How about this move, king h2, when you're also attacking both the bishop and the knight? Well, then it's knight takes f2. You take another pawn, and white has no time to take with the rook on e3 because of knight g4. With the knight fork, you're picking up the rook. Now you understand why white didn't play this move queen g4, and instead the move c5 was played. Very logical move, as you want to keep that bishop out of the attack. If that bishop is not going to join play, then white has possibilities of neutralizing black's initiative with the move queen to g4 coming next. Even if you take on c5 now, you can play here this move queen g4, that's fine. But even better probably is just to take on e5, after which you can just take on f4 and the attack is over. So we go back one move, not pawn takes c5, but black played here beautiful move. This is the beauty of chess, guys. Your rook down, and it looks as if you have all the time in the world just to play a little pawn move, h5. The pawn on h5 prevents the queen from coming into g4, and that means white doesn't have an efficient way of kicking black's pieces out. The knight and the queen are incredibly strong. You cannot bring your queen closer, and well, in the game, they followed this move, rook e2. That's looking like a very sad move, but black, of course, is not going to take with the knight, and the knight, one of the best attackers, is no longer on the board, and you're still a piece down. So what black's idea here is to bring another piece into the attack. Rook e8 with a simple plan of getting a rook over to g6, and that's checkmate. White played rook e2 with the idea to bring the queen over to f1. Now you take on e2 with check, the queen takes back, you're only a piece down, but the rook comes to e6 and rook g6 is next. So white got to move its pieces back into defense. Knight g2, blocking the g file, rook g6, threatening checkmate on g2. The queen goes back to f1, and it looks as if white has managed to protect everything. But the attack is not over yet, because the h-pawn comes even one square further to h4. That's a fantastic move. And how should white make use of the extra piece? These pieces are too far away. Know that taking the pawn on d6 is never a good idea, because that just brings the bishop from a7 back into the game. So white played here this move, rook c1. White is trying to maintain that pawn on c5, shutting down that diagonal. The bishop remains out of play, but black has an alternative plan now to open that diagonal. With this fantastic move a5, he's challenging the base of the chain. Had the pawn been on a3, the move a5 would not have made any sense, because then the pawn is protected. But now the pawn on b4 will be eliminated first, and next the pawn on c5 will be gone. Bishop c3 was played with the idea that if you do take, you take with the bishop, and if you take the other pawn on, then the bishop can take on c5 and everything is well covered. But a much better move is not to release the tension here yet, but play the move queen g4. So you're threatening to play h3, winning the knight on g2. King h2, and the pawn goes to h3, attacking the knight. Knight goes to e3 to attack the queen. And now it's the move queen f4 check. That's a good move, because where's the king going? You cannot take the pawn on h3. You don't want to do that. Runs into queen h6 with checkmate. So therefore the king has to go back to h1. Queen f3, check. King goes back to h2. Queen f4, king h1. But black goes on here with the move d takes c5. That's a good move. You're taking this pawn, and very soon this pawn will be gone. So the bishop is ready to take on e3 at some point. For instance, if you do take the pawn on a5, this is just analysis, then the move c4 can be played with the plan of taking on e3. If you take on c4, you can give a check. You go king h2, you take on e3, so the knight is no longer on the board. Pawn takes back, rook g2 check. King h1, rook f2, discover check. You're about to win the queen, king g1, and now it's h2 with checkmate. Here you get to see how this attack is working, and that white's piece is absolutely useless. White decided to take back on c5, but now queen f3 check was played again, king h2, and now bishop takes c5 anyway. And we have the same plan. Black is just intending to get rid of that annoying knight. And well, there are so many problems here. Just one other line here, for instance, if you would bring your rook to e1 with the idea to take back with the rook on e3, then it's again queen f4 check, king h1, and now the pawn goes to h2 with the idea to play rook g1, winning the queen. And you cannot really stop it. If you go rook g3, you can just take the rook and white cannot take back because then the queen on f1 is just hanging. So therefore, after bishop takes c5, white played here the move queen h1, offering the exchange of queens, covering the g2 square one more time, but it does hang the pawn on f2. Queen takes f2 was played, and Fabiano Caruana resigned here, because if the king takes the pawn on h3, it's queen g3 with checkmate. This was a fantastic game full of sacrifices, and I think very easy to understand. I hope you liked it, and you also do what you have to do. That's subscribing to the channel. And I will cover more exciting games from this final of the Champions Chess Tour in Toronto.